Northern Minnesota lakes in early September carry a particular kind of silence, the kind that settles thick over still water when summer crowds thin and autumn has not yet fully claimed the trees. Pine lines the shoreline in dense walls, broken only by narrow gravel clearings where campsites sit just far enough apart to feel private. The lake that weekend lay under low fog that rolled in before sunset and refused to burn off completely even after dark. 5 friends had driven up from Duluth for a 3-night trip, intending nothing more dramatic than fishing, cheap beer, and a break from work. They chose Site 14 because it faced open water rather than deeper forest, believing visibility across the lake offered comfort. The fire pit sat 10 yards from shore. 2 tents were pitched slightly uphill beneath spruce cover. Another, closer to the gravel landing. They cooked at dusk, cleaned properly, stored food in sealed coolers inside the locked truck, parked 20 yards back along the access path. Wolves lived in that region. Everyone knew that. But wolves typically avoided established camps, especially those with engine noise and human scent layered thick. The first howl came just after midnight. It began low and stretched long across the water, rising from somewhere on the opposite shoreline. It was not close enough to trigger panic, just close enough to register as presence. One of them, Matt, unzipped his sleeping bag and listened through nylon. The fog distorted direction. The sound seemed both across the lake and slightly behind treeline at the same time. Another howl answered from farther left, thinner, younger perhaps. The chorus did not escalate into full pack frenzy. It remained measured, spaced, almost conversational. Wolves communicate territory and position through structured vocalization. That is normal. Matt rolled over eventually and slept again. The second howl cycle came around 2:10 a.m., closer than the first. This time the sound carried less echo and more body, a deeper timbre, likely adult male. It rolled across the lake surface and seemed to settle directly over the campsite. One of the women, Claire, whispered into the dark that it sounded closer than before. No one replied. The fire had long since died to embers. Fog thickened, swallowing the opposite shoreline entirely. If wolves were on the far side, they were invisible. If they had crossed the shallow narrows at the lake's north end, they would be equally hidden by the tree line behind camp. The howling stopped abruptly after the second cycle, not fading, stopping. That detail stayed with Matt longer than the sound itself. Predators that howl continuously advertise. Predators that stop abruptly often move. Morning revealed nothing unusual. No tracks near tents, no disturbed gear. Just damp fog lifting slowly off water in pale ribbons. They laughed about it over coffee, half joking about being watched. Wolves rarely approach 5 adults in active camp. The statistical risk felt negligible. That confidence lasted until the second night. Fog rolled in earlier, thicker, swallowing shoreline before dusk fully settled. They built a larger fire, partly for comfort, partly to reassure themselves that flame creates boundary. Around 11:30 p.m., the first howl came again, but this time not from across open water. It came from tree line behind the truck. The sound was short, sharp, a location call rather than territorial broadcast. Another answered from farther left. The spacing between responses suggested flanking positions rather than distant echo. Matt stood from the fire and walked 10 yards toward the access path, shining his flashlight into fog. The beam dissolved into white, before reaching tree trunks clearly. Nothing moved. He listened for paw movement on gravel. Heard nothing. The howls did not repeat immediately. Instead, branches cracked faintly somewhere beyond visibility. Not heavy like a deer crashing through brush. Lighter, coordinated. Claire told him to come back toward the fire. He hesitated only a moment before stepping backward. Wolves that approach camp often test perimeter with noise and then withdraw. That is typical. What was not typical was the silence that followed. Total. Insects seemed to pause. Even the lake felt muted under fog. They extinguished the fire eventually and retreated into tents, nerves humming but logic still dominant. Wolves do not attack groups without cause. Wolves assess risk carefully. That reasoning carried them into sleep. Around 3:17 a.m., a scream tore through the fog. Not long, not theatrical. Cut short, mid-breath. Matt shot upright, heart slamming. The sound had come from the smaller tent closer to shore, Ryan's tent. Matt unzipped and stumbled into cold fog, flashlight beam cutting frantic arcs across white air. Ryan's tent flap hung open, not ripped, open. The sleeping bag inside lay partially dragged toward the lake edge. There were no heavy blood pools visible on gravel, just scuffed dirt, and a single dark smear leading toward shoreline reeds. The fog swallowed depth beyond 10 yards. Another howl rose somewhere within that white curtain, closer now, layered with a second voice just behind it. This was no distant territorial call. It was coordination at close range. Matt shouted Ryan's name and advanced 2 steps toward the waterline, before Claire grabbed his arm and pulled him back hard. Something moved in the reeds, low, fast, then gone. The lake surface remained flat and blank under fog, offering no reflection. The remaining 4 stood frozen in open gravel clearing, flashlights trembling in their hands. The wolves did not rush the group. They did not charge into firelight. They withdrew into fog with their silence intact. And as dawn slowly diluted the white curtain hours later, the shoreline showed a pattern that erased denial completely. Multiple parallel tracks pressed into damp sand, converging at the tent site and diverging again toward a narrow game trail leading deeper along the lakeshore. Not random wandering, not opportunistic curiosity, structured approach, structured retreat, and one sleeping bag drag line ending abruptly, where reeds met deeper brush. Dawn did not bring clarity, only shape. As the fog thinned in slow gray layers over the lake, the shoreline revealed what the night had hidden. Parallel tracks pressed deep into damp sand, larger than coyotes, spaced in measured intervals that suggested coordinated movement rather than chaotic scavenging. The drag line from Ryan's tent ran 15 yards before splitting where the reeds thickened, and beyond that, the ground hardened into pine needle and root, where detail vanished. Matt crouched at the edge of the reeds and felt the tremor in his own hands as he traced one print with his fingers. Fresh, defined. No overlap from deer or smaller animals. Claire stood behind him, gripping her phone, despite knowing there was no signal deep in that northern basin. The truck remained where they had parked it, doors closed, windows intact. Whatever had taken Ryan had not tested the vehicle. That detail mattered. Wolves assess structure. They avoid sealed metal barriers unless compelled by hunger or desperation. Here, they had chosen the tent closest to shoreline, the one most isolated from the main cluster. Selection implied calculation. They searched the immediate tree line cautiously, shouting Ryan's name into morning air that swallowed sound in wet layers. No answer came back, except distant crow calls. The game trail along the lake shore showed clearer sign once the sun burned through enough moisture to dry the top layer of sand. The tracks multiplied there, at least 6 individuals by Matt's rough count. One larger than the others, likely the alpha male based on stride length and pad width. 2 smaller, but not juvenile. This was a full, hunting-capable pack. Claire whispered what none of them wanted to articulate fully. Wolves rarely target adult humans unless extreme conditions shift normal prey balance. That region held deer, beaver, and smaller mammals in healthy numbers. This was not starvation. They moved as a group back toward camp and packed quickly, adrenaline replacing shock. The plan was simple. Reach the ranger access road 5 miles south along the Lakeshore Trail. Driving out immediately would require passing back through the same timber corridor the Howls had come from. The Lakeshore route offered longer exposure but clearer sightlines. They left behind Ryan's torn tent and the cold fire pit, stepping into a landscape that felt rearranged. Fog lingered in low pockets even after sun touched upper pine branches, creating visual fractures every few yards. As they advanced along the trail, Matt noticed something else. The wolves' tracks did not simply lead away from camp. They paralleled the direction of the shoreline path at intermittent intervals. The pack had not retreated deep inland with their kill. They had moved along the lake's edge. Wolves that secure prey often drag to secluded cover and remain nearby to guard and feed. But this movement pattern suggested something different. Escort. The realization chilled him more than the night scream had. By mid-morning, they reached a small clearing where an old canoe lay overturned near a rotting dock remnant from decades past. They paused to drink water and reevaluate orientation. Claire scanned the far side of the lake with binoculars. Nothing visible. The opposite shoreline looked serene, almost artificially calm. Then Matt heard it, a low rustle off the trail to their right. Not wind, not a single animal shifting, layered movement. He turned slowly and saw a gray shape standing 20 yards back, between trunks, watching. It did not flee when seen. It held eye contact for a breath longer than comfort allows, then stepped sideways and vanished into timber. Seconds later, another appeared briefly farther ahead, along the shoreline path, before disappearing as well. Flanking positions again. The pattern from the second night replayed in his mind. The short howl behind the truck, the answering call from the left. Wolves use vocalization to establish spacing before movement. If the pack had crossed the shallow northern narrows after the first night's howls, they could have approached silently under fog cover on the second. And now in daylight they were maintaining visual pressure without overt aggression. Claire's breathing quickened. "They're hurting us," she said quietly. Wolves herd prey by applying pressure to flanks and controlling forward path through presence rather than direct attack. It is energy efficient and psychologically destabilizing. The group tightened formation instinctively, moving shoulder to shoulder along the shoreline trail. The lake on their left limited lateral escape. Dense pine to their right restricted retreat depth. The geometry was narrowing again. Around noon, as heat lifted fog fully and sunlight sharpened shadows, they reached a narrower section where shoreline curved inward around a rocky point. There the tracks became clearer in dry sand. Multiple passes, some fresh enough that grains still collapsed at edges. The wolves were not following at distance. They were leapfrogging ahead, repositioning through inland cuts to appear along the path intermittently. That is learned strategy, often used on deer when pushing toward waterline traps. Matt's stomach tightened as the implication settled. They were being managed within terrain rather than simply shadowed. The scream from the night before echoed in his head again, abrupt and cut short. Wolves that commit to a human target must overcome significant risk calculus. For that threshold to be crossed, the pack's confidence must already be high. Confidence is built through successful engagements. As they rounded the rocky point, Claire froze. Ahead on the trail lay a scrap of fabric, caught on low branch, a torn piece of Ryan's sleeping bag liner. It had been placed there deliberately, or dragged past that exact branch height. Either way, it marked proximity. The wolves were not merely escorting them away from territory. They were demonstrating that proximity could reoccur at will. Matt swallowed hard and forced himself to keep moving. Panic fractures spacing. Spacing invites test. The lake remained flat and deceptively peaceful beside them, sunlight now fully breaking through. But the forest behind held depth that no amount of daylight eliminated. And somewhere within that timber, gray shapes were adjusting position in response to every step they took, maintaining a perimeter that felt less like random wildlife presence and more like controlled containment. By early afternoon, the shoreline trail began to narrow into a strip of packed earth no wider than a deer path, pressed between exposed granite outcrops on the lakeside and thick balsam and spruce on the inland side. The openness that had given them a fragile sense of safety earlier dissolved into compression. The lake, once a visual anchor, now curved away behind rock points that blocked long sightlines. Matt felt the geometry shifting again, the same way it had the night before, when the fog erased depth and sound swallowed direction. Claire kept checking the map on her phone, even though GPS reception flickered in and out. The ranger access road lay 3 miles ahead, but those miles were no longer neutral distance. Every few hundred yards, one of them would spot movement. Never a full charge, never a sustained pursuit. Just gray shapes appearing briefly between trunks, and then fading as if testing reaction. The wolves did not howl during daylight. Silence had replaced vocalization. Wolves that howl broadcast. Wolves that go silent stalk. Around 1:40 p.m., they heard the first clear trot behind them. Light but coordinated. Multiple sets of paws hitting dry needles at measured pace. They turned together and saw 2 wolves standing openly on the trail 30 yards back, not concealed, not hesitant. One larger, shoulders thick, coat darker along the spine. The other leaner but equally steady. They did not advance. They held. The message was unmistakable. Retreat was no longer an option. The group pivoted forward again and increased pace without breaking into a run. Running fractures formation and triggers chase reflex. But increased pace also elevates fatigue, and fatigue invites mistakes. The forest seemed to breathe with them, closing in through density rather than sound. At the next bend, the trail split unexpectedly, one branch leading closer to the waterline over uneven rock, the other veering slightly inland through heavier timber. Claire hesitated, trying to recall which branch led more directly to the access road. That hesitation cost them seconds. From the inland branch, a wolf stepped out openly, blocking the darker route. Not aggressive, just occupying space. Another appeared near the waterline branch farther ahead. The pack was no longer content to shadow. They were steering. Matt chose the waterline path instinctively, preferring exposed rock to enclosed timber. They moved on to granite slabs slick with moss near the lake's edge. The footing was unstable, forcing single-file progression. That compression was immediate vulnerability. As they crossed the rock shelf, a third wolf emerged from behind driftwood, farther downshore, pacing parallel. The spacing tightened into a shallow semicircle, open only toward forward movement along the shelf. Claire's breathing became ragged, and she stumbled once on slick stone. Matt grabbed her arm before she fell fully. The wolves responded instantly to the stumble, advancing 5 yards closer in synchronized step, not sprinting, testing fracture. He realized then that this was not a random predatory impulse. It was incremental conditioning. The pack had likely observed campers here before. Humans walking along shoreline follow predictable paths. Wolves push deer toward water where footing fails. The analogy was too direct to ignore. They reached the end of the rock shelf where the trail re-entered timber briefly before opening again near a marshy inlet. As they stepped into the tree line, the temperature dropped noticeably and sound shifted into muffled echoes. Then it happened fast. From the right flank, hidden in thick spruce, a wolf lunged not at the center of the group, but at the trailing edge. Tom, who had been quiet most of the day and slightly slower from exhaustion. The contact was sudden and violent, jaws clamping onto his pack strap and shoulder simultaneously. He screamed and fell backward into pine needles. The rest reacted on instinct, shouting and swinging trekking poles wildly. Matt drove his pole downward toward the wolf's muzzle, while Claire sprayed bear spray in a wide arc without aiming precisely. The capsaicin cloud filled the small timber pocket quickly. The attacking wolf released and retreated 3 yards, blinking and shaking its head, but did not vanish entirely. 2 others stepped closer at the edge of the mist, testing whether the defense would hold. Tom scrambled to his feet, blood soaking through the sleeve where teeth had punctured skin beneath the pack strap. The pack's advance halted under sustained noise and spray, but the circle did not dissolve. Instead, the wolves withdrew 20 yards and resumed pacing parallel as the group forced themselves forward again. The escalation was unmistakable. The scream the previous night had not been an isolated anomaly. The pack had confirmed vulnerability threshold. They had tested tent intrusion under fog, executed extraction, and now applied pressure in daylight. Wolves rarely commit to human predation unless prior success lowers risk barrier significantly. That threshold had been crossed. As they pushed toward the marsh inlet ahead, sunlight broke through canopy again, but relief did not follow. Open marsh meant less cover for wolves, but also less footing stability for humans. The trail narrowed into wet ground laced with reeds and shallow pools. Movement slowed again, and the wolves repositioned once more along higher, drier banks. The geometry remained consistent. Push forward, close flanks, wait for fracture. Matt understood something terrible in that moment. This was not hunger-driven chaos. It was sustained engagement built on confidence. And confidence in predators comes from repeated success. They were no longer being escorted away from camp. They were being worn down along a corridor that offered no true escape except forward into unknown terrain. And the access road, still miles ahead, had never felt farther. The marsh inlet swallowed sound differently than the open shoreline had, reeds absorbing echo while shallow water sucked at boots with every step, slowing movement just enough to widen the gap between intention and execution. Tom's sleeve was soaked dark, where teeth had punctured through fabric, the wound deep but not disabling, and that fact alone kept panic from fracturing the group entirely. Matt forced them into a tight diamond formation again, injured inside, spray and poles outward, and they moved through the reeds with controlled pace rather than frantic flight. The wolves did not rush during the marsh crossing. They paced along the higher ground bordering the wetland, gray bodies cutting between birch trunks in measured arcs, maintaining distance but never relinquishing line of sight for long. Wolves conserve energy. They do not waste momentum unless probability shifts decisively. What they were doing now was erosion. Wear the prey, compress options, force fatigue. When the marsh narrowed into a firmer spit of land that connected to the final timber stretch before the access road, Matt saw the geometry tighten one last time. The lake curved inward again, forming a shallow cove on their left, while the inland side rose slightly into denser spruce, where visibility collapsed into shadowed layers. The wolves began to appear more openly now, no longer content with brief flashes. 2 moved along the lake edge, 3 along the inland rise, and 1, larger, darker, held center distance directly ahead, walking backward slowly while facing them. That posture erased any remaining illusion that this was incidental wildlife presence. The pack was managing spacing deliberately, holding pressure from multiple vectors. Claire's breathing had gone shallow, and her hands trembled visibly around the spray canister. Matt felt his own fatigue creeping in, legs heavy from adrenaline depletion. That was the moment predators wait for, the drop between surge and exhaustion. The larger wolf ahead stopped entirely and lowered its head, not in submission, but in focus. The others adjusted position in near-perfect synchronization, widening slightly to cut off lateral escape. The access road lay less than a mile beyond the timber rise. But that mile now functioned like a funnel. Matt made the decision that felt both reckless and necessary. "We don't let them control pace anymore," he said, voice tight but steady. They moved forward together in deliberate advance, not running, but closing the distance toward the central wolf, rather than allowing it to dictate spacing. That shift disrupted the rhythm briefly. The wolf stepped back, recalibrating, and one on the right flank edged closer in response. Claire deployed spray early this time, a broad cloud that drifted sideways into the approaching wolf's path. It veered sharply and retreated 5 yards. For the first time since dawn, the pack's formation fractured slightly rather than tightening. Momentum matters in predator calculus. The group pressed forward again, shouting continuously, poles raised high to exaggerate height and cohesion. They crested the inland rise where timber thinned into mixed scrub, and through the branches Matt saw the pale strip of gravel that marked the access road ahead. The sight injected a surge of energy that bordered on reckless. The wolves sensed it instantly. The larger male lunged without warning, not at the center, but at Claire on the left flank, where fatigue had slowed her step half a second too long. The impact knocked her sideways, jaws clamping onto her forearm. She screamed as the wolf attempted to drag her backward into brush. Matt drove himself into the collision, slamming his full weight into the animal's shoulder, while Tom, despite blood loss and pain, swung his pole down with both hands onto the wolf's ribcage. Claire emptied the remainder of the spray directly into its face at point-blank range. The reaction was explosive. The wolf released and recoiled violently, shaking its head, eyes squeezed shut against capsaicin burn. The rest of the pack surged forward 2 steps in reflexive support, then halted when the group did not break formation. That hesitation was everything. Predators commit fully only when fracture is irreversible. The humans did not scatter. They advanced as one toward the road, dragging Claire upright and half carrying her across the final stretch. The wolves paced alongside for several yards more, but once boots hit gravel and the open corridor widened beyond tree cover, the pack slowed. Open space reduces concealment advantage. Vehicles and scent layering increase risk. The larger wolf stopped at the tree line edge and stood watching as the 4 remaining figures stumbled down the road toward distant signage. It did not howl. It did not charge. It held position until they were fully beyond timber shadow, then turned and disappeared into the forest without sound. Emergency responders reached them within 40 minutes after a passing trucker caught sight of their frantic signals. Claire's arm required stitches, but no arterial repair. Tom's shoulder puncture was deep but survivable. Ryan was never found, not in any state that could be returned. Wildlife authorities would later investigate the lake perimeter and confirm an unusually bold pack in that region, likely reinforced through successive predation events that had lowered their human avoidance threshold. Fog rolled back across the lake the following week as if nothing had shifted. Campsites reopened after review. Wolves remain apex predators, cautious by design. But caution erodes under repeated success. In northern Minnesota, where shoreline and timber compress into corridors of limited choice, geometry can become weapon. The first night had been sound without sight. The second had been silence before extraction. By the third day, the pack had stopped announcing itself entirely. And long after, gravel replaced pine needles under their boots, Matt would remember not the howl that started it all, but the way the wolves stopped howling once proximity replaced distance. Silence, not sound, had marked the true beginning of the hunt.